My grandmother always told me never to repeat the words if I heard them in the desert. She would lean close, her wrinkled hand pressing against my lips, and her eyes would narrow with fear.
Larali Larila,
She said once, but then shook her head so violently you'd think the words themselves burned her tongue. She would whisper a prayer afterward, trembling as though something invisible was already listening. I asked her many times what the phrase meant, why she feared it so deeply. She never gave me an answer that made sense, only that it was not a song but a calling, not something meant to be spoken aloud. It was, in her words, a rope thrown out into the dark, and anything waiting out there could pull itself closer when you tugged it. To me, it was just nonsense, an old superstition that clung to the desert like dust on skin. Years later, long after she was buried, I joined an archaeological team sent into the Sahara. We were searching for evidence of long-forgotten trade routes, lost settlements buried beneath dunes that shifted like waves on the sea. Our group numbered 7 in total. Myself, Carlo the Italian researcher, Amira the Egyptian guide, Jonas a historian from Germany, 2 graduate students from Britain named Sarah and Ian, and our leader, Professor Roth. We carried maps, satellite scanners, and crates of tools, but none of it prepared us for what we would find. It began when we uncovered a half-buried satchel in the sand, its leather so worn and brittle it fell apart in my hands. Inside we found a journal, its pages yellowed, its writing half-erased by time. Some words were still legible, though shaky and written with desperation. 3 days since water, the mirages sing, Larali walks. Larali walks. He bends low, trunk searching, sandals scraping. The sound won't stop. We are not alone. The entries stopped abruptly, the final page smeared with dark stains that were not ink, but dried blood. We gathered around in silence, our lanterns flickering in the wind. Professor Roth frowned, muttering about dehydration-induced madness, but Carlo's face turned pale. He whispered something under his breath, the words crawling out of his throat as if they hurt to say.
Larali Larila,
It wasn't an academic recitation. It was recognition, memory. I asked him what it meant, and he only shook his head and refused to speak further. His eyes, however, betrayed the kind of fear that a man only shows when his mind drifts to old nightmares. That night, the wind screamed across the desert and shook our tents like thin drums. While the others tried to sleep, I caught Carlo sitting alone by the lantern, his hand clutching his rosary beads, though he mouthed no prayer. When I pressed him for answers, he told me a story in a trembling voice. There was once a wandering monk who had walked the desert centuries ago. He sought enlightenment, not through comfort, but through suffering, swearing that only starvation and thirst could bring him closer to God. He prayed endlessly for transformation, asking to be made strong like the cactus, able to store water forever, to never thirst. He prayed for memory like the elephant, so that wisdom would never slip from his mind. And he prayed for feet that walked softly like sandals, leaving no trace, so he could become a ghost on the sands. Carlo stopped speaking then, but the wind carried something faint, almost like a laugh stretched thin. I pressed him further, and finally he said the desert had answered, but not in kindness. The monk had been transformed, body torn and reshaped into something that was neither man nor beast. His prayers were twisted against him. He became a cactus with an elephant's face, his body fused with leather straps that dug into flesh, sandals that could never be removed. He wandered endlessly, thirsting forever, cursed to walk. The wind outside howled louder, and I could swear the noise bent itself into a rhythm, as though whispering back to us.
Larali Larila, Larali Larila.
At first we laughed nervously, brushing it away as imagination. But in the morning, Amira was gone. Her cot was empty, her pack untouched, her shoes still lying neatly by her bed. We searched desperately, our voices echoing into the vast dunes, but no answer came. Instead, we found tracks in the sand, a trail of bare footprints leading away from camp. Only they were not hers. Each print was too wide, long, with strange rounded impressions near the heel. They looked like sandals, ancient ones, pressed into the sand alongside her smaller steps. Carlo went white when he saw them. He whispered through gritted teeth, "He's walking again." His voice was hollow, the words falling into silence like stones into a well. I grabbed his shoulder and demanded to know who, but he only repeated the name. Larali. He walks and he calls. And when you hear him, you follow. His fear infected the others. Sarah and Ian muttered about leaving, while Jonas scribbled in his notebook furiously, as though writing down details could protect him from what we had seen. That evening, when the sun melted into red dunes and shadows stretched like knives, we saw it. A figure shimmered at the horizon like a mirage, half real, half fog. It had an elephant's head that drooped low, its trunk dragging lines in the sand. Its body was no flesh, but a grotesque cactus, spiny and swollen. Green skin split with cracks where moisture seeped like sweat. And on its feet were sandals, enormous and fused into its hide, leather straps embedded into skin like scars. It did not lumber. It did not walk as an animal does. It drifted, sliding across the sand as though weightless, yet leaving behind faint imprints that burned into the earth. The creature paused, and even though its face was only that of an elephant, I felt it look at me. My heart froze in my chest. The desert was dead silent, not a single grain of sand shifting. Then came the sound, not from its mouth, not from the wind, but from inside my head, pushing against the inside of my skull.
Larali Larila.
We locked ourselves inside the tents, huddled together like children, though fabric was useless against what we had seen. The whisper never left. It hummed in the back of my teeth, scraped the edges of my skull, and bled into my dreams when I tried to sleep. Somewhere outside, beyond the thin canvas walls, something walked. The sand shifted in a steady rhythm, sandals scraping with every step. And then, long past midnight, a mirror returned. At first, we thought it was a relief. She stood at the edge of camp, her silhouette wavering against the lantern glow. But something was wrong. Her skin blistered, her lips cracked and bleeding, her eyes glazed as though she had not blinked for days. Her voice rasped, hoarse and broken, but she repeated the same words over and over. Larali Larila, Larali Larila. She swayed as though caught in an invisible dance, her head bobbing like a puppet's on strings. I rushed forward, but Carlo held me back with iron strength in his trembling arms. His voice cracked as he shouted, "Don't touch her. She's already gone." I stared at him in disbelief, but when I looked closer, I saw her feet. Each step she took in the sand was not hers. The imprints were wide, round at the heel, the same sandal shapes we had seen earlier. It wasn't Amira walking. It was something else wearing her body. We watched as she collapsed into the sand, her voice choking into silence. Her lips twisted into a smile, though her body was limp and lifeless. The last sound that escaped her chest was not a breath, but a laugh, hollow and wrong, as though it had never belonged to her. By morning, her body had vanished, and in its place we found 2 enormous sandal prints burned deep into the earth. Carlo finally told us the truth. The monk had become a parasite, cursed to wander forever, feeding not on water, but on voices and souls. He returned every few generations, always first as a rhyme whispered by children, passed like a game, then as a mirage at the edge of vision, pulling the curious closer, and finally as himself, walking once more, searching for those foolish enough to listen. The rhyme was not meaningless. It was a trap, a net woven from sound. When you repeated it, you called him. And when you called him, you gave him your voice, your body, your soul. His sandals, Carlo whispered, were made of those who had followed him. strips of leather, woven from the dead, carried across centuries. It was a trap, a net woven from sound. When you repeated it, you called him. And when you called him, you gave him your voice, your body, your soul. His sandals, Carla whispered, were made of those who had followed him. Strips of leather, woven from the dead, carried across centuries. That night, Jonas awoke with a start. I saw him hunched over his notebook, scratching words in frantic strokes, his hand trembling so hard the paper tore. When I leaned over, I froze. His writing was no longer in English. It wasn't in any language I knew, just the same words repeated endlessly.
Larali Larila, elefante nel deserto che cammina qua e là. Con la sua conchiglia e un orologio che fa tic.
His lips moved silently, echoing the words as his hand obeyed. When I tried to shake him from his trance, his body convulsed violently. His mouth opened wide, and the sound that escaped was a trumpet, like an elephant's cry stretched into something wet and gurgling, a noise that vibrated through my bones. His eyes rolled back, and his skin began to crack, flaking into sand before my eyes. His last breath carried a single word, hoarse and sharp: thirst. Then he was gone. The villagers tried to comfort their children, telling them it was only a song, only a game, but some of the older folk knew better. They whispered that the chant was much older than anyone could guess, that it belonged to the sands themselves, that it carried the weight of lost souls who never returned from the dunes. Pilgrims traveling near the borders of the desert wrote of strange mirages, not of camels or oases, but of a hulking figure walking endlessly, cactus skin glistening like wax in the heat, elephant head drooping low, sandals worn to the bone, though no bones were visible. Each account ended the same. The traveler felt themselves humming the tune unconsciously, even before they had heard it. It was during the late 19th century when an Italian ethnography named Pietro Caldini became obsessed with these desert stories. He was a man fascinated by folklore, particularly the songs that survived across generations without origin or meaning. He traveled from village to village, collecting fragments of the rhyme, writing them down carefully in his journals. He found that no matter where he went, the children always sang it the same way, with the same rhythm, the same haunting melody. When he asked them where they had learned it, they only shrugged and said, "It has always been here." Pietro stayed awake at night in his tent, staring at the pages, trying to convince himself it was only coincidence. But he could not deny the chill that filled the room whenever he softly whispered the name.
Larali Larila.
One night, as he prepared to leave a small village on the edge of the Sahara, a girl approached his campfire. Her skin was pale from sickness, her lips dry and cracked. She asked him for water, and though he gave her a flask, she did not drink. Instead, she smiled and said, "Don't listen when he sings." Pietro asked who she meant, but the girl only repeated, "Don't listen past the 11th loop." Then she collapsed into the sand and vanished, her body dissolving into dust before his eyes. Pietro's journal for that night was written in frantic scrawls, the ink blotched by what seemed like trembling hands. He wrote of hearing the sound of sandals brushing against the sand outside his tent, though no one was there. He wrote of a whisper, not in his ear, but inside his head, repeating the chant over and over. In the decades that followed, Pietro's journals were locked away in archives, considered the ramblings of a man who had gone mad under the desert sun. Yet fragments of his work leaked into popular culture, embedded in nursery rhymes and children's games across Europe. By the early 20th century, the chant
Larali Larila
began appearing in recordings, folk collections, and even music boxes crafted by artisans who claimed they had dreamed the melody. Families bought these trinkets for their children, unaware that those who listened too long often woke up at night with bleeding noses, or walked in their sleep toward the nearest open space, their lips mumbling the cursed refrain. Some never returned. As technology advanced, the chant adapted. Soldiers during World War II reported hearing it in the wind while stationed in North Africa. A survivor of Rommel's campaigns wrote in a private letter that the desert did not need bombs or bullets. It only needed Larila. He described seeing a grotesque creature walking past the trenches at night, not attacking, not even acknowledging them. But each soldier who gazed upon it died days later, their skin shriveled and their eyes hollow. The bodies were buried quickly, without explanation. The letter was confiscated by military intelligence, labeled as delusion. Yet the families of those soldiers wrote back describing the strange lullaby their widowed children began singing in their grief without ever being taught. By the 1970s, folklorists tried to revive Pietro's work, but strange accidents plagued their research. One scholar, Dr. Helena Rossi, recorded herself humming the chant into a tape machine for analysis. When she played it back, her own voice had warped into something deep and guttural, like an animal trapped in the desert wind. She laughed it off at first, but days later, her colleagues found her apartment empty, the tape recorder still spinning, the chant looping endlessly. The neighbors swore they had heard sandals dragging across the hallway all night long. Helena was never found. Today,
Larali Larila
exists as a joke in online spaces, a meme spread for laughs and confusion. Its cactus-elephant form with sandals is considered harmless, even funny. Yet, in the dark corners of the internet, there are warnings not to engage too deeply. Forums scattered across the web contain testimonies of users who looped the audio too many times, or stared too long at the creature's imagery until something shifted in their peripheral vision. Some claimed their microphones picked up breathing when no one was in the room. Others swore they began to walk barefoot in their sleep, leaving trails of sand across their carpet. These stories are dismissed as creepypasta, brainrot nonsense, but every so often, a username goes silent, never posting again. The truth is,
Larali Larila, elefante nel deserto che cammina qua e là. Con la sua conchiglia e un orologio che fa tic.
Has never been a character. It was never meant to be cute or funny. It is a parasite of culture, attaching itself to voices, to rhythm, to repetition. Every time it is sung, a piece of the desert is carried into the present, and Larila walks again. When people laugh at the meme, they feed it with their attention, just as the caravans fed it with their blood long ago. That is why it cannot be killed, why it keeps resurfacing across centuries, shifting forms from rhyme to folk song, from whispered chant to viral meme. It is not peace that keeps Larila walking. It is hunger. And if you are reading this, humming the syllables under your breath, you are already part of its path. Thank you for tuning in. Please leave a like and subscribe. And I will see you again next week.